So I went to go watch Deadpool 3 and it was pretty good. Don't worry, if you haven't seen the movie, I'm going to do my best to avoid spoilers for now. But if you haven't watched it, I semi-highly recommend this movie. It's pretty good. Anyways, to start things off, the number one thing I appreciate so much about this movie is that the jokes are handled much better. Now, they're not PG-13 jokes either, but what I mean about the jokes being handled better is that they're much more than "you look like an avocado that had sex with another avocado." I fucking hate that joke, and I honestly can't even call it a joke. That's probably one of the worst lines I've ever heard in my entire life. Like, I wasn't knee slapping, gasping for air laughing, but I was grinning and chuckling a lot more than the other Deadpool movies. But the jokes I liked more in this movie were more so about the jokes with the cameos and Disney and Fox. I'll get to those later because I don't want to spoil it for you if you haven't watched it. And as of right now, the number one thing that people find funny about this movie is Ryan Reynolds dancing to Bye Bye in the opening scene. And I didn't really find it that funny. Now, I'm not saying it can't be funny. Now, these are the jokes that I don't really find particularly funny, and these aren't the jokes that really make me laugh, but I can see why people like it so much. Now, the other thing I really liked about this movie was the action. If you like the action in the other movies, believe me, you'll like it in this film. Unfortunately, these fight scenes have no fucking color to them. There's more blood on the screen than there is color, and that's saying something for a Deadpool movie. And I think that's honestly because all of these fight scenes take place in a Breaking Bad, Albuquerque, New Mexico type place, and it just doesn't work for me. And one of the last things I really appreciated is how this movie handles its cameos, because honestly, Deadpool 3 had me more shocked than when Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire came back at some points. And the movie manages to do this by bringing back characters that you would never expect. Now, don't worry, I'm not gonna say their names right now. The soundtrack is also really good. Even with all the licensed music and whatnot, the soundtrack tends to be one of this movie's highlights from beginning to end. And that's about it for things that I did and didn't like without getting into spoilers. But the last thing I want to talk about is the main protagonist. Now, the main protagonist who was shown in this trailer is probably one of the most boring protagonists I've ever seen. Like, she doesn't do anything. I don't even remember what her name was. I had to look that shit up. I think the reason why a lot of people just didn't like her is because she's not memorable at all. Like, she doesn't grow on us, and she really is just a nothing character. At the end of the movie, all you'll get from her is, oh, she's really powerful and she has motives for living inside Ant-Man, and she's the sister to Charles Xavier. Alright, that's really about it for the Bald Lady of Death. I still have no idea what her stake in the plot even was. And the last thing that did not land for me at all, and that has to be the emotional impact. See, the other two movies, even though they had their ups and downs, still had some very emotional moments. The only Deadpool scene that made me tear up a bit was the end scene of Deadpool 2 when you think he's about to die. I'll dig a bit deeper with this point here in a few because it'll make more sense once I get into spoilers. But at the end of the movie, it just can't manage to wrap itself up in a good way. After the army of cameos, if you can even call them that, happens at the end of the movie, I feel like that's where the movie kind of drops a ball for me. It doesn't help that Deadpool keeps looking at the camera telling us we're almost done with the movie, because in reality, this movie just had a bad time wrapping it up. Okay, now this is your last chance for spoilers. If you haven't seen the movie, this is your last chance for spoilers. Okay? Alright. I also didn't like how this movie handled its multiverse plot, because the way they handle it included a lot of exposition like every 10 minutes from the fucking side characters. See, the problem with the multiverse plot in this movie is that it's handled in a way where there's really two protagonists, one of them being the bald lady and one of them being that agent from the TVA, and those two want to try to destroy the multiverse or something. Meanwhile, Deadpool promises a different Wolverine that isn't from Deadpool's world, and then promises the other Wolverine that Deadpool Deadpool will save his planet if he saves Deadpool's planet, even though Deadpool's planet is being destroyed because his Wolverine died, but it will somehow be revived if Wolverine helps him. Meanwhile, we have a TVA agent that is searching for a machine that can fix ripples in the multiverse, but that doesn't matter because the bald lady, who could have just left her wasteland universe at any time, finally decides to leave her planet and go use that machine to do something. Then the TVA agent tells Deadpool and Wolverine that if they want to save their planet, they need to hold hands while holding on to something that will kill them, like in the Guardians of the Galaxy first movie. But then they don't die because, yeah, why would Disney kill them? They just bought their studio. Meanwhile, we have Bald Girl, TVA agent, Deadpool, and Wolverine throughout this movie trying to convey this information to us, and it doesn't work. And you see why the plot to this movie just doesn't really make that much sense. Anyways, to talk about the cameos, if you haven't seen this movie, you saw that Henry Cavill, Channing Tatum, and Wesley Snipes have made their cameo debut in here. There's a lot more cameos in here, but these three are just the main ones I want to focus on. I specifically want to talk about Channing Tatum's Gambit because I thought he was really fucking cool. Also, like I said in the last video I made about the X-Men, you will probably have to watch any character who plays Gambit in subtitles because I have no idea what Channing Tatum was saying half the time. I can't show you his character designs, but he was the one character I was genuinely wanting to see more of. Because of all characters of all movies, it had to be a fucking Deadpool movie that finally gave us comic accurate X-Men movies, and Channing Tatum does Gambit's accent really well. One nitpick I would make is I kind of wish his hair was a bit longer and his eyes were just naturally red. But hey, that's just me. Chris Evans saying "Flame On" kind of caught me off guard, and it soon makes you realize it's just Fox characters coming back. And the one thing I found funny about this character was his end credit scene at the end. I thought that was hilarious, but I guess no one else is really talking about that. And unfortunately, Chris Evans loses his flame powers because he fought the only mutant whose powers was manipulating fire. What a fucking idiot. And people did see the Fox logo being destroyed in the background as a bit of a parody, but it's really much more than that if you can believe it. It's kind of the studio's way of saying goodbye to those shitty ass movies in the past. Most of those early day X-Men movies were really bad, and I do like that they are saying goodbye to those. Lastly, I want to talk about Deadpool's plot in the story and the other characters we saw in the other movies. If you didn't realize, TJ Miller ain't in this movie anymore, and that's probably a good thing. I hated his character so much, and if you don't know why he's not in the third movie, just go ahead and Google it real quick. I don't have time to get into details, but you'll realize the other characters like Vanessa and Wade break up off screen after he saved her in the last movie. It really just doesn't make any sense to me, but I also didn't like how all the other characters were kind of forgotten about, like Colossus ain't doing nothing, Negasonic Teenage Warhead ain't doing nothing. I mean, they literally only had a few lines in this movie, if that, but that really has to do more with the movie's way of how they handled its multiverse plot. I already talked about it, so I'm not going to repeat myself, but Deadpool's character arc revolves around him wanting to matter to the world, but in the end he doesn't fulfill this arc. And see, there are ways to write Deadpool fulfilling wanting to matter to the world, but it really just doesn't feel like he accomplished that in this movie. It doesn't feel like he actually wants to matter half the time in this movie, because half the time he's just fighting Wolverine and making fun of the other multiverse movies while still being a multiverse movie. Anyway, this doesn't ruin the movie for me, but I think the worst ways to handle a multiverse plot is by saying to the audience that there's two worlds at stake or whatnot, because that shit just never works. I mean, look at Crisis on Infinite Earths. That shit was awful. Anyways, time to wrap things up. I really didn't feel comfortable giving this movie a score because I feel like I still need to rewatch it a bit, but I'll give it a full review whenever the movie comes out. So realistically, it's a 7 out of 10. But I mean, it's a Deadpool movie, so that doesn't really matter. And I know a lot of Twitter users and whatnot are going to say this movie is the best MCU movie of all time, and this movie will put the MCU back on track. And I don't really agree with this movie being the best MCU movie ever, because it's not. And when people say that, it kind of diminishes what this movie was going for. It's just a really fun movie, much like Logan, but Logan isn't the best superhero movie ever made. It's just a really good movie, and I don't think a single movie will be able to put the MCU back on track. I think that has to be a process that is done with multiple other projects, not just one. But honestly, I would say it's a top 10 Marvel film, but it ain't 10.